All right, there we go. Um, so as Brian mentioned, I have recently become the executive director of this new research institute called Springtide. And our focus at Springtide is on this intersection that we call the sort of intersection between young people's daily and religious lives. What we found, what we kept hearing was that like 13 to 25-year-olds, what we call young people, are asking and trying to grapple with what are essentially like religious questions in the broadest sense of the word, meaning, what should I do with my life? What's the purpose and meaning of life? And what, maybe what happens when I die, and how do I live a good life and be a good person, and et cetera, et cetera. But whereas, for the previous maybe 50 years or so in our country, young people just aren't connected to those institutional sources and leaders like they used to be. So we know that attendance numbers are down. I'll talk about some of the other reasons why those institutional connections are not there. And so at Springtide, our entire mission is to try and figure out like where young people go for that guidance and those answers, and not only where they go, but sort of what kind of guidance can impact them, what can make a difference in their lives. And Belonging is our first study that just came out this week, actually, Reconnecting America's Loneliest Generation. So I want to share with you some of the findings here that I think are particularly pertinent for your organization. You all are not faith leaders, so we're not going to talk about this through that lens. Instead, I want to talk about this through the lens of what it means to be lonely and isolated, and what the broad applicability is there. Easy for me to say, right? And the first thing I think is worth noticing is just pausing to reflect on, for many of us who are working at home, adults are getting this real sense of how disruptive and weird and lonely that can be if you're on a we're in Colorado where the stay-at-home orders. I haven't left my house in I think we were just tallying it up the other day. Maybe I haven't left at all in the last 5 or 6 days, and I haven't seen or talked to really anybody outside of my house in the last 2.5 weeks. We're coming right up on the time that our family starts to feel like we're in the clear, so that's good. But it's really weird, right? And one of the strange things about being in this situation is I feel simultaneously disconnected from all of those communities and groups that I used to be a part of, but also my family is here all the time. It's like they think that they live with me. So it's this simultaneous loss of alone time and loss of community, which is this very strange place to be. It's almost like being constantly connected at a very low level, finding myself on Zoom calls a lot, and people checking in maybe at a surface level, and text messages and family. And sociologically, what we know what is happening here is that our lives are divided up primarily into two different aspects. There's what we call the front stage, which is literally what I'm doing right now, performing in many ways for you. But and this is the way we also perform the roles of husband, friend, brother, spouse, etc. But then there's this backstage where we sort of practice and rehearse all of those things in our minds. It's where we're doing self-talk and all this stuff. And that usually only happens in alone time. Well, what we've all experienced collectively over the last couple of weeks is that division has largely gone away. And so part of the reason why this feels so unsettling is because we don't have those clear divisions between what is backstage time and what is front stage time. Now, I want you to think about, for young people, this is more or less what they are always dealing with. This disruption between front stage and backstage, where you're sort of always on, but at a very low level. The research shows that that's increasingly what young people deal with more or less constantly. And that's imagine living with this disruption all of the time. The other thing that is so important to understand is that our brains are not really made to be alone. We can do, and we need alone time, for short periods of time, but neurologically, our brains aren't really able to sustain our sense of identity, our sense of personality, our sense of self when we're alone all the time. And this is true not only when we look at micro level studies, literally looking at the neural responses in the brain, but also to individual responses, solitary confinement, for example, but also the sociology here about groups of people and which societies manage to thrive and which ones have ultimately fallen away. And sort of the way our bodies have adapted to this is that when we think we're being left out, when we think we're being excluded from something, the brain actually processes that feeling of exclusion in the same way that it experiences physical pain. So your brain has the actual same pain response to thinking that somebody's gossiping about you and leaving you out, as if like you dropped a hammer on your foot. That we experience that as actual pain. And so with any of these things, the question that you should be asking yourself is like, why? Why would we do that? Well, I mean, you know, when I was, I think we can look to the examples of other pain to help us understand the answer there. And, you know, when we think about the times when we've hurt ourselves, we probably wish that we hadn't hurt ourselves, but it doesn't take long to figure out like why we have that pain response. So I've got a scar on the back of my hand here, from when I was, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years old. And I went into, I was getting ready for school and I went into my mom's bathroom to tell her something, and just casually put my hand down on the counter, and it was right against the back of her curling iron, right? Which is incredibly painful. And I ripped it away too, you know, fast, but not fast enough, obviously, to keep the scar from forming. So in that moment, there's pain, but of course that pain is a protective mechanism. And what that protective mechanism is, obviously, is that if I had left my hand there, I would have done a lot more long-term damage than just a scar. The pain response tells us to stop doing the thing that we're doing. That's the same rationale that goes into this experiencing of social isolation as pain also. It is meant to drive us back to other people. It is meant to drive us back to the group. For a long time, it was simply a survival mechanism of, you know, if you were excluded and isolated from the group, from your tribe, you know, you were unlikely to be able to literally live. We haven't, you know, as the years have gone by, the eons have gone by, we haven't dropped that pain response. We still see this showing up, and it still plays the same kind of protective effects, because we know that people can't survive on their own, even though your daily needs can be met, your social and emotional needs cannot be. So the pain response that drives us is intended to remind us that we need to be, you know, a part of a group. And unfortunately, that is just not what's happening anymore. So Cigna, the big health conglomerate, did a study a couple of years ago now, 2018, reporting some of these facts. This is for all Americans 18 on up. Nearly half of Americans reported sometimes or always feeling alone. 1 in 4 rarely or never feel as though there are people who understand them. And crucially, and this is where Springtide comes in, Generation Z, ages 18 to 22, the loneliest generation, claims to be in worse health than people older than them. So this was the first time ever. Social scientists have been measuring loneliness and isolation for a long time. There's a really good scale out of UCLA that helps us to norm these things, and it's been around since the late 70s or early 80s, as I recall. And it's almost always, as you know, if you stop and think about it for a second, you can probably understand why, but it's almost always the oldest generation that is the loneliest. As they lose their mobility and freedom, and they start losing some of their networks and their community, they get increasingly, usually isolated. What has happened in 2018 is that we saw that it wasn't the oldest generation for the first time ever, it was the youngest generation. And not only was the youngest generation the most lonely of any in that study, it was the most lonely that any generation had ever been. And this all comes at a time when that seems to be super counterintuitive. When we think about teenagers, the dominant image that comes to most people's mind is of somebody on social media. And so we have this sort of this image in our heads of young people as always being connected to each other. And so it's very counterintuitive that they would find themselves, that they would rate themselves as being incredibly lonely and socially isolated. And as it turns out, those connections that are largely mediated by digital and social media are useful. They play some role, but they're not enough. They don't play quite the role that we might suspect that they do. So at Springtide, we wanted to extend this study and think about it through our own lens. So we surveyed 13 to 25-year-olds, all the way down to 13-year-olds, which is the youngest age group that we can get data from with parental consent. And what we found is that 66% of them have 3 or fewer meaningful interactions on a typical day. So the way we asked this question on the survey was, how many interactions do you have that are not just about the weather, et cetera? But how many actual interactions do you have that you would characterize as meaningful, online, in person, wherever, parents, friends, doesn't matter, total? And 2/3 of them said they have 3 or fewer. A few years ago, I was, as Brian mentioned, I run the social research lab at our university, where we do data collection and analysis projects, and all of the campus ministry groups came and said, we want to survey your campus. So they gave us a little bit of money. We developed a survey, and one of the questions on it that they wanted to know was this question. This is where I got the idea from. And so they're like, all right, so how many meaningful interactions do you have on a daily basis? We start whipping up the question, and the answer was, the first category was like, 0 to 4, and then 5 to 9. And I start writing this out on the big screen in our lab, and my students stop me immediately, the students who work in the lab, and they go, no, the first category has to be 0, and the next category has to be 1, and then you can go to 2 to 5. I'm like, that's crazy. We live on a college campus. Like, we're on a college campus. These students live here. Surely nobody's walking around with 0 or 1 meaningful interaction on a daily basis. So we settled this in the way you're supposed to settle everything in higher ed. We made a bet, and I lost. I said that if 0 or 1 ends up being one of the top 3 answers, if either of those ends up being one of the top 3 answers, we'll go to Starbucks on me. So $85 and 3 lattes later, I was paying up on my end of the bet, because I was stunned. I mean, it just floored me, because 1 meaningful interaction was actually the second highest answer. That there are students who are like eating in dining halls, living in dorms, and going to class. One of what I think of in my head anyway is one of the most social places on earth, having 1 or fewer meaningful interactions. So we obviously, the majority of 13 to 25-year-olds are not on a college campus. They're somewhere else that's even less intrinsically social than that. And so by the time we got to this data, unfortunately, it didn't super surprise me, even if it is still alarming. And there are really big consequences here. Young people are alone and isolated at their most vulnerable moments. As we know from basic human development theory, that this results in a time when people are trying to figure out their identity, trying to figure out who they are, making really big life decisions, not always the best ones, not always with a whole lot of literal brain development capacity for long-term consequential thinking. And they end up doing this in a way, when they're alone, that leads to more stress, which can also complicate decision-making. Young people who experience isolation and loneliness are 3.5 times more likely to be severely stressed. It has the same impact on mortality as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And there's a consistent link between isolation and mental health issues such as depression, suicide, et cetera. So the evidence is pretty overwhelming about why we need to care about the fact that young people aren't as connected as they need to be. Looking behind the numbers, there's this really fantastic op-ed in the LA Times last summer by Varun Soni, the Dean of Religious Life. He says, whereas students at USC, whereas students used to ask, how should I live? They are now more likely to ask, why should I live? And when they used to talk about hope and meaning, they now grapple with hopelessness and meaninglessness. And then he says this part, he writes, I never got the question in my first 5 years at USC that I now get almost daily from students. How do I make friends? Students may have thousands of friends online, but few in real life. They may be experts at talking with their thumbs, but not so much with their tongues. As a result, many feel as if they don't have a tribe or a sense of belonging. They feel disconnected from what it means to be human. That is sort of heartbreaking. And USC is a very, well-to-do private university campus, which is not the place where you would necessarily think is dealing with the most hardship. In other words, the things that I think we can see there would only be exacerbated by the other mediating effects of, say, low income or dealing with a traumatic household, et cetera. Not that USC is necessarily a paradise, but it would be protected from some of those things. So there's real consequences. There's not just numeric, but also qualitative evidence that suggests that this is something that we need to be paying attention to. Now, crucially then, part of the reason that accounts for this this like misconception that young people are super connected and therefore can't be alone is because we're using old metrics. We're using these metrics of participation to give us some sense of whether or not young people have a feeling of connection or belonging. And we asked about this in our survey. So we asked them, you know, do you participate in band or other after-school sports, band or other after-school activities? You know, are you involved in things outside of your house? Do you go to church and religious functions? You know, do you belong to clubs, et cetera, theater, and on and on? And what we found was that participation in those things had no impact on their loneliness and isolation. Whereas I think, you know, even for me growing up, participation automatically came with a sense of belonging. That was how you got plugged in, quote unquote, somewhere, or how you gained a sense that you had found your people in your community. But these two things are no longer correlated. Just because somebody's involved in a lot of activities or because they're showing up somewhere doesn't mean that they feel connected to that group. And that's a crucial change that has happened just, I would argue, most acutely for young people in the last 15 years. And the reason for this has to do primarily with how young people interact with institutions. So if we look at the data about confidence in institutions, trust in institutions, from the 1970s to today, we see a pretty stark difference. If any, I told you I was a professor, so here's the quiz. You can answer it silently. Does anybody notice a trend? Because if I made you a cheat sheet if you couldn't get the right answer. Every single one of them is down and down. I know some of you are looking over there at Congress and wondering why they're so high, still at 11%. It's okay. These data are from last year. It's probably significantly lower now, right? Every single one of them has gone down. Americans, this is not a snapshot from last month with coronavirus. This is data that is consistent over the last 40 years, 50 years, that Americans just don't trust institutions. So even if we're still engaged with them, even if we're showing up to them, we don't necessarily feel a sense of belonging there because we don't automatically think that they have our best interests in mind. And this goes doubly, if not triply, if not, you know, X whatever times for the young people that you all work with that, you know, definitely wouldn't necessarily think that the institution has their best interests in mind. We asked this question specifically of 13 to 25-year-olds then, because that last data was from Gallup that tracks everybody 18 and older. And this is how we asked it of 13 to 25-year-olds to rank on a scale of 1 of no trust to 10 complete trust. And you can see that nonprofit organizations are at the top, but even nonprofit organizations barely cross the midpoint. In other words, nobody's doing particularly well here, even among this target age group of 13 to 25-year-olds. So I think that this has automatic and necessary implications for the kind of work we do when we work with young people. Whereas we used to be able to lead with our credentials and our authority and our, you know, our rank and our position and our title. What this tells us, along with the qualitative evidence, which we don't have a whole lot of time to get into, but is basically like young people don't care about how you are relative to some institution because they don't trust those institutions. So, you know, if you come rolling in with your title to say like, I'm such and such and such and such, that's you in relation to an institution. And if the young people don't trust those institutions, you don't have any credibility because of your title or affiliation with that. And I know how difficult this is to hear because I have a PhD and work for an institution and would really like my students to just automatically trust me, but they don't. Instead, they question and challenge every single thing that I say, even if it would make my job a lot easier for them to just say like automatically run with the things coming out of my mouth. But that is not the reality. What is needed instead, since these titles and credentials don't or cannot carry the day, is that we need to lead from a different place. So in order to understand this, I want to go back just a little bit and do some sociology with you all. Make sure the animations can work here. Oh yeah, the animations are all screwed up. Okay, so I'll make them all go and then we'll, there we go. So then I'll explain them. So on the left-hand side of my screen anyway is traditional authority. This is the way the world was organized prior to the Industrial Revolution, when everybody was basically farmers. It's why all these people are dressed the same and they're holding the same thing. That one guy in the middle of the top there, he's the king. He's in charge because his daddy beat up somebody else's daddy who beat up somebody else's daddy, right? And that's the way we got authority. Trust came because basically we knew that we were all in this together and we were dealing with the same things. We haven't lived in that world for like the last 250 years. Instead, we've been on this other side in this organic solidarity place with rational legal authority. Those are all technical terms. What it means essentially is that we have division of labor, and our trust comes because we have these external credentials that mark somebody as being capable of doing something. In other words, the dentist cleans my kids' teeth, I teach their kids sociology, somebody else is running the government. You know, we each have a role to play. I don't know what my neighbor's life is like, but I trust that my neighbor does something productive. And well, not the neighbor across the street. That neighbor apparently exists just to annoy the snot out of me. But everybody else seems to do something, you know, that is like productive and contributing to the world. And that's how we built trust up until about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. We're in the middle of this shift, though, where we can't just toss our credentials out there anymore, but also we don't just automatically know what each other's realities are like. Instead, we need a new kind of authority, this relational authority. The only thing that is going to get people to actually make the kind of changes and have the kind of impact that we want. I'm really sorry about the animations here. I don't know what happened. Is for you to stand in the middle of these things. So the way I usually talk about this is that while your credential doesn't matter, your expertise is sorely needed, and young people definitely want your expertise and your guidance, but they will not listen to you at all until you have a relationship with them. As soon as you do have a relationship with them and they understand and believe that you have their best interest in mind, they'll do at least what the research shows. They'll follow you to do just about anything that you want them to do. Now, obviously, all of this has to be filtered with caveats through the lens. Especially through a lens of trauma for young people who've had those kinds of backgrounds. But relationships remain at their core. What our research showed was that we can create a sense of belonging through this unique process that we call noticed, named, and known. In other words, the first step is just to acknowledge somebody's presence. Secondly, that we name them, we start to integrate their beliefs and their feelings into the groups, if there's a group, but we start to account for them and start to understand who they are as a person. And then level 3 is that they're known, in the sense that like we couldn't think about this project that we're doing either as a group or as one-on-one mentors without them. That this is a unique thing to their presence, that it wouldn't be the same, and it's reflectively not the same as if they weren't there. So that they're having some marked impact on the group. And each of these stages can be broken down, but rather than going through all of them in the interest of time here, what I would like to do is just sort of give you one concrete way that we can start on this noticing part. And I would say that step 1 is just being the adult in the room. And I don't mean being the grown-up, I mean being an adult in the room. Because nearly a third of young people have 1 or fewer adults, and 1 in 10 have 0. And this is when we even include their family members. When we ask them, how many trusted adults do you have in your life, including friends, including family members, parents, extended family, etc., nearly a third said 1 or fewer. This is incredibly damaging because young people who have trusted adults in their lives are far less lonely. They're less stressed, they're more confident about the future, but only if it's a personal relationship. So again, we're not talking about like, did you go to a youth group on a Wednesday night where the pastor stood up and said something? That doesn't count as a relationship. We're talking about young people who have a trusted adult that they can count on to be there for them. And how, or what kind of impact does that make? Well, we can see this here. As we move down here from at the top to the bottom, from 0 trusted adults to 5 or more, we see these numbers. The first 3 we see these numbers just drop precipitously. From feeling completely alone, no one understands me, I feel left out, and I'm feeling stressed and overwhelmed. Even the presence of just 1 adult takes this number of I feel completely alone from 66 to 46. And the real impact starts to come in when we get multiples at 2 to 4. Now, no one organization should think of themselves as responsible for making all 5 connections. But if we could even make 1 or 2 of those in your capacity for each young person, then we're going to be a long ways down the roads towards helping them to make really good choices and reducing that stress and that cognitive impairment that comes with it, because young people simply don't think that anybody is listening to them. I was recording a podcast with a young person the other day, asking them to sort of respond to our data, and was showing them this quote by Megan, who was in our study, and they said, "Oh yeah, that's 100% true. Like, young people feel invisible all the time. Like, it's more common that I feel like nobody's paying any attention to me than I feel like I'm getting attention at all, negative or positive. Mostly just people are ignoring me," which is sort of, again, heartbreaking. So how do we do that? Well, I think that it comes back to this meaningful interactions part, that we just need to start fostering ways to have regular, ongoing, where young people feel like you're voluntarily checking in on them, seeing how their day is going, not as part of a program, because again, programs are institutional, et cetera, not as part of a script, but out of genuine care and concern. That's where we get these meaningful interactions, and it's the meaningful interactions that have such a buffering effect. Fostering even just one meaningful relationship per day reduces the effects of isolation by nearly 50%. So like, we can have a dramatic impact here for many young people with just a little bit of the right kind of work. Megan puts it this way. She says, "I don't feel like I belong if I don't have people to talk to." And so I think that part of this in step one, in the noticing, is just to show up and listen. That adults have not historically and are not currently doing a really good job systematically of making sure that young people feel heard and listened to. And the result is that young people end up feeling isolated and alone. The mismatch, again, is because we think that, well, they are being heard. Look, I took everything they said as feedback when I created this new program, or like when we designed this curriculum for them. But they see that as an institutional response, not the personal kind that they really need. All right, so I think that gets us through the main research findings there. I'm really curious about questions and about how you all sort of see this filtering through the lens of the work that you do, because I know that this shows up differently in every context.
Yeah, so if you have any questions for Josh or comments right now, just unmute your microphone and then ask away. And Josh, I guess, I could start. I wrote something down. So if youth don't have, or young people don't have intrinsic trust in established organizations or institutions, are you saying that intrinsically they have trust in relationship and not in the individual at first? But I guess maybe explain that a little bit more if you could.
Yeah, that's what they kept telling us, that the only pathway to trust was through, like, your credential is consistently showing up. In other words, like, that they don't automatically trust you because of a particular role that you play in their life or a title. I think there's a lot of reasons for this, especially again through the lens of trauma, that the people who are supposed to automatically be trustworthy haven't been particularly trustworthy for them, and so the defense mechanism there is just like, well, the only way that you're going to earn my trust is not by being externally credentialed or certified by somebody or some organization, but it's going to be because I have personally vetted you, and deemed you as like worthy to be in my life. And young people are they're super used to adults like having to be in their lives, and so they can tolerate them and put up with them. It's not like they'll shut you out completely, but in order to actually be able to make an impact, those things have to be filtered through genuine care and concern.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
I think one of my questions is, with pretrial, we're required to check in with kids every so often and kind of go over basic, how's your family life, how's your school, how's meeting with your therapist, kind of just surface level stuff that can eventually lead to deeper stuff. But how do we make those questions and those things that we in our roles have to check off and let the court be aware of, but doing that more intentionally and letting, trying to earn their trust through those conversations rather than just getting answers.
Yeah. Plus y'all work under, with caseloads and time constraints, and like, how do you manage all of that? So I'll give you an example from a personal experience. Well, two actually, both involving the same kind of like requirement, but from different perspectives. So we're homeschooling right now, right? So all the kids are, like many of you have kids at home trying to work their way through Pearson online math or whatever. But the state also mandates that teachers do a particular kinds of work for especially elementary school kids, checking in on their home lives and looking for warning signs and things like that. And so my son's 10-year-old, he's 10, and his teacher is having these Zoom calls with him. And so I think I've learned part of the answer just in the last couple of weeks, which is that you just have to be willing to have a lot of really awkward conversations because she has to have this contact time with him, right? But he's 10, so he, is not really used to sustaining a 25 or 30-minute interaction with an adult for, in a way that is like sit down and look at the screen. But what she's doing is like, by being willing to sit there and listen to him, say whatever's on his mind and continue to ask him questions, even when he gives 1 or 2 word answers, she's building up a level of trust. Now, the other example is from the university. So we have to do advising. We're required to do advising every semester. And I hate what advising has become. I don't know if you all had this when you were in college, but basically advising has become, go to a professor to help you make your schedule for next term. And that drives me crazy. Like, I grew up in the era of Dead Poets Society. I want to be Robin Williams and like sit down with young people and get them to jump up on the desk and make a difference in their lives and find out their deepest dreams and, help them become a success in life. And when they come into my office, they're hoping for it to be a 10-minute interaction so that I can give them a 5-digit code that will allow them to register after I've made their schedule for them. And so I just hold it. Like, I have it written down on a piece of paper when they come in. I do the pre-work ahead of time that I can do. And I just tell them, like, I'll be happy to turn this over, but first you're going to answer 3 questions because I really care about you and I want to make sure that you're getting the best about this. So they know it's a script that I've got for them, and I'm tracking it and keeping notes. But the way that we're doing it is in such a way that goes just a smidge beyond what we're required to do. And so the impact comes not in that particular session, but over the long haul, so that I'm able to, even though I have an advising load of 30 or 35 or 40 students that I see once a semester, I'm still able, when I email them, to pull up those notes, or when I come back in, to do that kind of work. So I don't think it has to, in other words, I don't think it has to be done just in that session. I think that there's a long-term effect of making the effort, because I think what young people often don't see is anybody making the consistent effort. And so those case notes that you take, adding in a question or 2 that's extra, being willing to sit and listen for a minute or 2 longer, and then keeping track of the things that they said and asking about them, those are massive. I mean, I think like for adults, it's so weird because most of us have been able to like structure our social lives in ways where those things happen naturally. And we assume that they're happening that way for teenagers too, because maybe it did for us. But these data and other data show us that like those things are just not happening. Young people are just not getting that durable sense of continuity.
Hey Josh, this is Aaron. I have a question. I was at a motivational interviewing training recently, and I heard a quote that said, compliance is temporary, and the only way to create real change is through connection. And obviously, from your research, you would say that connection is the best way to create real change. But I'm wondering if you think that it's the only way, and what would you do if you had a kid who you're working with who, say, just won't open up, won't trust you, has a real, F you, F the system kind of attitude, and is connection the only way to go with those kids? And if so, what's the best way to kind of foster that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is what these are my like oblique references to, we know that trauma changes everything, right? And so for kids who have had those really severe experiences with trauma, or even like mild experiences with trauma can sometimes have dramatic effects. I think it does require a different tact and a different approach. And in that case, this research becomes not irrelevant, but it becomes background that informs what I think we should be doing here. So there is actually some really great, like, in this notion of like, well, is compliance okay? Should we always just be striving for true fundamental influence through relationships? But there's some really interesting research about the importance of repeated compliance can actually create new neural pathways and new norms for behavior and activities. So in other words, like some of this comes from like whether or not you should pay your kids for grades. Like that's a short-term kind of compliant thing. But there's some really interesting research that over the long haul, if you're consistent about that system of incentives and rewards, that it will create new patterns of behavior that you can then convert over into relationships. So in other words, these tracks aren't as mutually exclusive as we once thought that they were. It doesn't have to be just one or the other. You can do short-term compliance and be building up long-term relationships in the same process.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Meredith.
Hi, Meredith.
So I think about those kids that like are specifically not wanting to have a relationship and are pushing away. And sometimes how I deal with that is like, and probably not every time, but sometimes I feel like it's a control thing, and they're feeling like I have control, so this is what they can do to take control back. So I'm just like, if you don't want to be my friend, that's fine. You know, like allow them to have that. So then maybe we can build something naturally instead of, you know, trying to, you know, like, we're gonna be friends, which is, you know, kind of what I like to say to all my kids. You're gonna like me, it's gonna happen. But with those kids, I just kind of like, all right, like, cool, you don't have to be my friend, but we're gonna have to get this done. And then maybe after once, like, they have that control piece, then we can build on a natural relationship.
Yeah, and Meredith, it's really important. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And we have to remember that young people don't need friends. They have loads of friends, right? What they need are adults that they can trust and count on. And one of the things that really surprised me about this study was that we thought if anything was going to make a difference, we thought it was going to be the peer relationships. Like, you know, the more peer relationships you have, that was going to determine whether you felt lonely and isolated. But what it turns out is that, like, peers, friends, are often the source of as much stress as anything else for young people. Like, I think back to my own teenage years, and I was like, oh, right. Like, there were a lot of times that my own friends were the ones causing me to feel lonely and isolated. And I'm sure occasionally that I was doing the same to them. The importance of having an adult who will stick with you through that is not that you feel like you have a friend, but it's that you just feel like you have somebody who won't leave. So even if they don't like you, or, you know, you're not going to be friends or whatever, there's still really important benefits to be had just by showing up consistently. So I think that's, you know, we don't have to be friends with all the young. I mean, it'd be weird. I'm 42 years old. It would be weird if I was friends with a 15-year-old. Like, that's not normal. We can be friendly, right? But I don't, like, even the students, you know, you always have those like 1 or 2 or 3, you know, kids at any time that are really attached to you. Like, even my students who are 18, 19, 20 years old, like, we're not friends. I don't think they want me to be their friend. They want me to be their trusted guide. Okay. Well, I didn't want to get out of here without saying thank you. You all do really important work, and not only thank you for letting me come today, but thank you for all the work that you do for our community and for our state and for the world.
Thank you, Josh. You know, I just had one more thing.
Sure.
You really touched on the noticed aspect. Could you give us a bit more of the Cliff Notes on the next levels of relationship, which would be the named and known?
Yeah, for sure. So the naming part is both as simple as actually knowing their name. That's obviously the first step in there, but there's a little bit more to that too. And then the known part is when you start to actually impact the group. So the way I kind of think about this is if we were to take one example through all 3 stages, and we can think about it through an adult example here, like at my gym. My gym owner does a really good job of, when you walk across when you walk into the door of the gym, he says hello to you, acknowledges the fact that you showed up, which I'm convinced as an adult that if you just show up to a gym, you immediately lose like 300 calories. Because like that's half the battle, right? And so he's in that moment, like he's acknowledging that you have already won by acknowledging your presence, that you made this decision to be here today. you're already winning, and I see you showing up here, and we're winning together. And that's really important. So that's not anything that matters unless you're already filtering through this notion that like, oh, young people don't like institutions, and here they are choosing to be in my presence. I'm acknowledging that they're here, and that's a big step. So that's important. On the naming part, so not only when I walk through the door does he like say hello, but then he calls me by name. And so we're starting to introduce this small little like implicit level of accountability. One of the crazy things that showed up in the data was when we asked young people to rank the traits and characteristics that were most important to them for organizations that they wanted to be a part of. Now I get that this is different for pretrial. They're not usually opting for this, but accountability ranked the highest. Young people wanted organizations where other people were held accountable and where they were held accountable. And so when we start naming somebody, it's more than just like, I see you. It's like, oh, you're here and I'm expecting you to be here. And we are, we're all sort of looking at you here. And so it's that level of accountability that comes in with the naming part. And we can find all kinds of really, different ways to do that. That it shows up differently in different contexts, though, depending on how much leverage you have with social norms. So do you have like, group dynamics that you can, that can play a role for you here by like, say, assigning someone a task or a duty? This is that they have to then, produce something and show up for. So that's all part of that naming. And then in the known part is really about when on balance, you stop affecting them and they start affecting you or the group. In other words, that if you've got a program or a curriculum, or if you've got an activity that you're involved in, it fundamentally couldn't be the same way because without that person, that they're involved at such a deep and fundamental level in what you're doing that their desires are known, that their whole self is known, their past, their decision making, their values, et cetera, are known not just to you but to the group, and they feel like a full person in this moment. When we get through all three of those, we tip over into like two really cool things start happening. Number one, that individual starts feeling a sense of belonging to the group. And sometimes that group is very concrete and immediate, and sometimes it's very broad and sort of aspirational, like college graduate can be the group. But also it starts to create a culture of belonging if there are other young people around you. So one of the questions that comes up a lot is like, how do we scale? If we're taking a relational approach, like how do we scale relationships? I can only handle so many conversations, in one day because I'm only human. Well, when we start creating a sense of belonging here and a sense of belonging here and a sense of belonging here, what that does is it naturally attracts other people to start creating this process on their own with those around them, because young people are attracted to people who look like they're, are part of a group and a part of a tribe, and they want to join that. And so all those things that can be negative and exclusionary turn to start working in your favor when you start creating that culture. But you can't put the cart before the horse. We can't skip ahead. What we've seen in the research here is that you can't really skip ahead to just try and create that's like force your beliefs on somebody to try and get them to create this sense of belonging automatically. It has to go through those three stages. Does that help, Brian?
That does. No, that's great. I'm just looking at the clock here, and does anyone else have any other questions? It's about 10 to 1 right now. We usually try to wrap this up a little bit before the hour's up, but I'll just open it up for any last questions or comments. And if not, we'll wrap things up.
And I'm just going to assume everybody who's not on video is eating actual tacos. Is that fair?
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
No tacos.
No tacos from Margie. Okay.
All right. Well, Josh, thank you so much for meeting with us today and going through your research. Super informative. I hope that everyone on the call can take some of this and apply it to how they do their work or other aspects of their lives, especially in working with young people. So with that, I think we'll leave it for the day. And thank you everyone for coming as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.